I do a keynote like this, instead of giving you one long, boring talk, I'm instead going to give you 3 short, boring talks. This is going to be tricky, isn't it? I'm going to get blinded if I go in front of there. So the first talk I'm going to talk about is Agile Essence and Fluency. And this is a talk where I really want to get down to the origins and the core ideas of Agile software development, because they often get lost in various layers of communication and Chinese whispers. And then to explore a little bit a model of learning about Agile called the Fluency model that was developed by a couple of friends of mine. So it's important with anything like this to understand a little bit of the history of where it came from. If we look at software development in the 1990s, a lot of people were very concerned about a lot of factors, problems with software projects going wrong. And these kinds of things are probably not unfamiliar to you even now. But at that time, in the 90s, people were seeing this and complaining a lot about it. And there was a sense that the industry knew what the answer was going to be to these. That they said, yes, we know what we need to do to solve these problems. And that solution was what these days we refer to as plan-driven approaches. Big methodologies, capability maturity models. I think of it in terms of the idea of engineering-based processes. And I use that term because they were processes inspired by branches of engineering, such as civil engineering, where you go through this very detailed engineering, planning phase, and you separate that from the actual construction work. And people were saying, we need to be like real engineers in the software world, and that's where the future is, and that's how we get rid of these kinds of problems. But then there was a different bunch of people who had a different set of ideas. And their view was, well, you know, plan-driven approaches may be appropriate in some circumstances, but we have a completely different way of looking at things, and that has worked very well for us. And we want to explore this different style of working. And this was a whole bunch of people. It was folks like Kent Beck and Ward Cunningham with extreme programming, and Ken Schwaber and Mike Beadle with Scrum, and Alistair Coburn with all sorts of weird stuff that he does, and a whole bunch of different people exploring with these kinds of ideas. And that is what led to Agile and the Agile Manifesto. In looking at that and thinking about that, one of the things that struck me at the time was I had got a good bit of experience working in some of the early extreme programming projects, and that was kind of where I developed a lot of my understanding of this. But I was also fascinated by the obvious similarities between what we were doing, what Scrum was doing, and the like. And I didn't really understand what these connections were. And the way in which I figure something out is to write about something. And so I ended up writing an essay called The New Methodology, which was really to try and say, what's similar? What brings these things together? This was before we had the Agile Manifesto meeting, but it was kind of my attempt to try and pull things in. And I said, well, there's clearly a division between what the plan-driven folks are talking about and what the Agile people are talking about. And as I worked through and I thought about how to explain and think about this, I really boiled it down to 2 main differences, which I think are really at the core of what Agile thinking is about. It is a different attitude to planning, and it is a different attitude to the role of people and process. So I'll dig into these a little bit more, starting with the planning one. In the plan-driven world, there is, as I alluded to earlier, this notion of a separation of the planning of work from the doing of work. And again, if you look at it in terms of a civil engineering project, you can see this difference very clearly. The engineering is done by engineers who work initially in the offices, lay out detailed plans of how things will be put together, as well as the process that people will use to build things. And then it's handed off to usually a completely different organisation, a completely different bunch of people who execute those plans. So you have the notion of you do a detailed plan and then you carry out your work. And I would tend to think of this as predictive planning, because what you're doing is a plan is a prediction of how the work will go ahead. And that also boils down into how you measure success. How do people measure success in a lot of these things? They do it in saying, did things go according to plan? Were we on time? Were we on budget? That becomes the measure. Whenever you hear someone say X was a successful exercise because it went on time and on budget, that's a predictive planning mindset that's in use. But there's an issue with this, with software development. And that is, if you're going to do some kind of plan like this, you've got to have a very clear idea of what it is you're going to be building. You need to have an understood notion of what your requirements are, and they need to be stable. And because the plan is central to your whole software development process, it means everything you're doing in terms of software development is dependent upon having stable requirements. And therein lies the rub. How many people here are currently on a project, or the last project had requirements that were unstable, that were changing a lot? Yeah, that's usually what I tend to see. Oops, right? We're going to have an entire software process that's dependent upon requirement stability, and we never see stable requirements, or hardly ever. And the plan-driven people recognize this, so they say, okay, we've got to come up with stabilization techniques, all sorts of things that we can do to reduce requirements churn, to make sure those requirements stay stable. But they add a lot of complexity and a lot of work, and do they really succeed in stabilizing requirements? Usually not so much. The Agile crew look at this differently. We said to ourselves, okay, so we've got a software development process that's determined on stable requirements. Well, that dependency is a problem. We need to break that dependency. We need to say, how can we come up with a process that does not require the requirements to be stable? And so a lot of the thinking in Agile process is all about that. It lies down into the planning side, the idea of doing iterations, short iteration builds, and being deliberately encouraging people to shift things around in terms of that. The technical practices are based on that. The emphasis on automated testing uses techniques like refactoring, continuous integration, continuous delivery. These are all reactions to how do we operate effectively in a world where requirements are always changing. As Kent Beck said in the subtitle of his book, Extreme Programming, we're about embracing change. In fact, we go further than just saying, we can deal with changing requirements. As this phrase from Mary Poppending, I think, sums up really well, we want to actually see them as a good thing. The fact that we can work with changing requirements, this gives us an edge. This allows us to do better than other folks. And that also means the way we measure success has to be different. Success, saying something went according to plan is meaningless in an Agile context because the plan is changing every week. So instead, we have to look at success in another way. And so that's why you hear people saying it's all about business value. Have we produced valuable software that's improved life for our customers and our users? And I think that's a much more fundamental way to look at success than just according to planners. So that's the first shift. A shift from a predictive mode of planning to an adaptive mode of planning, where you're saying, treating the plan as a basis to handle change. The second shift is this role of people and process. How many people recognize this guy? Anybody? Pretty much nobody. How about if I give you his name? Anybody heard of him? Oh, one or two. It's kind of odd in a way. This guy has had more of an impact upon the life of people in the 20th century than almost anyone. Had an enormous effect upon our social world. He was an industrialist figure in America in the late 19th century, and he looked around at the way in which things were done then, when if you wanted some parts machined, you would say, oh, these are the parts that need machined, and the workers would decide how to do it. And he said, no, that's not how we should do things. This is the phrase that is most associated with him. He says instead we need separate planners who will figure out how the parts should be machined in great detail, exactly how you should do it, in what order, and that should be given to the workman, and then the workman will carry out those plans. We see social, he calls this is referred to as scientific management. And if you think of how industrial work has shaped itself in the 20th century, it is very much of that kind of world. I mean, when I did my industrial training, it was a very small amount on a factory floor, that was exactly the thing. You had exact detail of how you were supposed to carry out your machining work, and you followed that plan to the full degree. In software, this comes out in terms of processes, where we say, well, we've got a bunch of activities, perhaps a bunch of deliverables, we figure out what order they have to be done in, how the various deliverables feed into each other. And then we look at the people, and we broadly classify them. You know, we want 5 developers, 2 testers, 1 analyst, and a project manager in a pear tree. And then we fit people into those slots in the process. And that is the notion that says what matters is having the process. If you've got the right process, then any bunch of people with the right with rough classifications can fit in. The process is the central thing. That's going to be the key difference between success and failure. But that's not what the Agile folks said. I think it's summed up really nicely by Alistair Coburn, who he did a big survey when he worked for IBM of various projects, and said, one of the things I noticed is there's nothing I could find about the process that marked the difference between successful and unsuccessful projects. I couldn't find any process element that made a difference. The one thing that was consistently making a difference was that the successful projects had good people who worked well together in a human sense. That was the thing that mattered. And then they would find a process that worked for them, or they would have a process imposed on them, and then figure out how to subvert it so that they could actually get stuff done. And that is the shift. And one of the curious consequences of this is, you know, the very first phrase of the Agile Manifesto is saying we value individuals' interactions over process and tools. And that was written by a bunch of process weenies and tool weenies. Right? That's what we all were. And yet we recognize that processes and tools are second order. What matters is having good people and ensuring that they're working effectively as a social group. That's what the most important part is. And so the people are first. And that has a corollary that says that not just do we think about that when we think about forming teams and how to put people together, it also means that once you've formed that team, they decide which process they should follow. You don't have an external group saying you should do this. It's up to them to decide. And that's why you can't impose agile processes on teams. Teams have to accept it themselves and say, yes, that's the route we want to go. That's a thing that has, of course, happened since, as Agile's got more popular, is people say, oh, we have to do Scrum, so we're going to kind of force Scrum everywhere. But that's not how it works. And you also don't get standardized processes. I mean, big companies will often want to say, oh, we want a standard single Agile process. No, that's not how it operates. Teams have to figure out, how do I tailor what I need to do to fit the problem we're working on and the personalities of the team that we're in. Different people are different. I mean, yes, we'll have standard processes once all human beings have the same personality. But not until then. So what we see, so my sum up there is, that's the difference between the plan-driven thinking and the agile thinking. A different attitude to planning, adaptive rather than predictive, and a different attitude to the role of people and process. People first, then process.